you, James, and thank you, Hugh. I'm Anna Jones. I work for RNIB. RNIB were founded in 1868 by 4 men. 3 were blind, 1 was partially sighted, and their main aim was to improve literature for blind people in the UK. So I think my role as one of those within RNIB that still sort of is core to that. The work that I do is very much linked to, I think the title of my presentation is, going back, Accessibility in the Wider Market of Leisure Reading, which is a strange title, but I think what I wanted to do today before the other speakers is set the scene a little bit about what is actually happening in the wider market and what's happening in terms of accessibility for people, in terms of books that they're perhaps not reading necessarily in terms of study or in terms of research, but actually looking at what's happening in terms of the wider sort of trade market. So within the trade market, the majority of books and newspapers and magazines that are now published are published digitally. And the work that we've been doing is actually to ensure that readers with sight loss can access those books and they're able to enjoy them via an ebook format or via download audio in terms of fiction titles. And the mainstay of that is very much looking at books and titles being available at the same time and at the same price as everybody else within the population can read. And the difference there is that if you're waiting for a book to be produced into hard copy Braille format, or you're waiting for an audio version to become available perhaps in your local library, sometimes you can be waiting 5-6 months after a major fiction title perhaps has been launched into the wider market, and often would be paying much more because your production costs as publishers are much more for that title. Whereas the ebook, if the ebook is able to be manipulated in a way that James has just demonstrated, and I will shortly, then actually the price is exactly the same as the rest of the population that is using for getting that title. So ebooks for a blind or partially sighted person can be accessed in numerous ways, obviously via an e-reader, via tablets, via smartphones. And I have a colleague who says to me, I know you demonstrate on an iPad, which I'm going to do, and James was demonstrating obviously using his Mac there. If you're reading a title using synthetic speech, then actually using a smartphone is absolutely ideal for doing that because you're not reliant on screen size. So as a sighted person, you may not choose to read text necessarily, bar a short document on a smartphone, but actually if you're using the synthetic audio, then actually you are able to read books perhaps on an iPod Touch or on the standard smartphone that most of us have probably in the room got within our pockets. The ebook allows a blind or partially sighted user, again as James referred to manipulate the text. So for those that have got partial sight, enlarging font to a size that suits the residual sight they have, or inverting that font, and by that changing it from white on black to black on white is often enough for some people to be able to actually then utilise and read the text. Ebooks give people the ability to use synthetic speech, as we've just heard, and also to use electronic Braille. Electronic Braille is often connected, it's a refreshable electronic Braille display that can be connected to a PC or to an iPad or to a smartphone in certain cases in terms of iPhones, and a reader can then have Braille being read from these books. The issues that we face with ebooks are very much not just about how you access the book content and the content that's within a publication, but actually very much about can you access the menu to find it. And I know that people will think, well, what's she talking about there? My example will be there was a certain very popular tablet that came to the market last year, and although there was speech available within the device to read a book, there was no speech for the menus, which meant as a blind or partially sighted user, the device was just not something that was usable because the manufacturers and the makers of the device hadn't thought, how does someone actually find their book to start with and open their book independently to start reading? So often it's not about the published material, it's not about the software that's delivering the book, it's often about the device itself, and do other parts of that allow people to then not only access the book but to annotate, to search, and actually use additional features that are within ebooks that some of us may all use, such as dictionary functionality or the spelling of words. I'm going to demonstrate, and like James, I always have the absolute dread of a live demonstration of a piece of technology. I'm just going to demonstrate how somebody would use an iPad for reading. And the reason I'm going to do that is we often talk about blind and partially sighted people utilising devices, and people often say to me, I don't quite understand how you would navigate a touchscreen device. Perhaps if you're using a keyboard, then you would. The audio will come out of the iPad. I'm not doing the graphics up onto the screen, but hopefully you will hear what I'm doing, so you shouldn't need to see it. So I'm just going to turn the voiceover on.
Voiceover on. Google. Double tap to open.
So if you're navigating around an iPad. You don't need to look at it. You can literally, people would flick from left to right.
Around me. BBC News, BT Wi-Fi, Find iPhone, Shop Savvy, TripAdvisor, Tune Map, Currency, ZB, Style, H, Medal, Red, Speak, Train Line, Train Times, Shop Savvy, TripAdvisor, Tune Map, Currency, ZBMDM, iBooks.
So you would find the
Double
iBooks
tap
and
to
onto it, so you haven't got to listen to go through all of them. And normally when any of us as sighted people would just tap an icon and it opens, you double tap.
iBooks, Store, button.
And then to navigate through the store again, it's flicking left to right, and anything that you're doing is actually then giving you getting the audio feedback.
Collections, books, selected, list view, edit, search, Little Women, Louisa May at The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Great Expectations, Treasure Island, Rob Sample, Camp David, David Williams.
You know,
Opens the book, or double library, button.
So I'm now within the book, and to read the book, and this is where I'm actually going to stand sideways if I have to hold two hands, this is where I'm going to drop the iPad.
Page 8 of 37, Introduction. May I begin by offering my sincere apologies. If you have bought this book assuming it was a history of the President of the United States country retreat, sorry. This is the autobiography of a camp British comedian, me. I always found it.
Quite like that as a little, I used to use something classical like Great Expectations and Little Women, but when I read that introduction I thought it was quite good. The other thing people, readers have the option of doing is changing the voice. And I have a colleague who will never read anything, and that's the default language.
Characters. Language.
U.S. English. The President of the United States country retreat.
So you have US English.
Characters. Language.
British English.
Australian English, Irish English, South African English.
Default language.
U.S. English.
British English.
Australian English, Irish English. This is the autobiography of a camp British. This is the autobiography of a camp British comedian, me. I always vowed never to write about my life unless I was completely honest, and Camp David is a complete...
So that's the Irish accent, and obviously people will utilise different voices. A couple of my colleagues utilise the Australian English for many sort of reading of novels, because they feel it's actually slightly softer than the very plummy British accent, which is the default, or the American voice. So the ability to change the voice is also the ability to change the speed, which I wasn't going to demonstrate, but my colleague on the panel, Sarah, has asked me if I definitely will, which, as you probably may have heard when James was using his Mac, the speed of the voice that he was listening to was, I think, probably slowed down for our benefit today, James?
Characters, words, headings, selected, live. The book starts with my birth in 1971 and ends. Speech rate. 30%, 35%, 40%, 45, 50%, 55, 60%, 65, 70%, 75%. Introduction. May I begin by offering my sincere apologies. If you have bought this book assuming it was a history of the President of the United States country retreat, sorry. This is the autobiography of a camp British comedian, me.
Now, I definitely myself couldn't have understood much in terms of 65% speech rate with an Irish accent. However, I listen to my colleagues who I'm sitting next to, and I have a friend who uses an iPad, and people are listening to books and to publications at that speed, because that's the speed that is being used in everyday life, be it at work or study or whatever, for digesting information the same way as somebody with sight actually scan reads documents. So don't underestimate the speed that some of the things are actually sped up to. I recently demonstrated Dickens, and I was saying to an audience, can you imagine when he was penning this, using that he actually thought somebody would be demonstrating with an Irish accent going at that speed. So the other thing I just wanted to touch upon a little bit, very much about scene setting again, is we undertook some research in 2009 with Loughborough University to look at the top 1,000 most popular titles that are sold via with trade publishers in the UK. And to be included as an accessible title, a title had to be able to be manipulated into larger fonts, synthetic audio, and into electronic Braille. A reader also had to be able to find the title, as I mentioned earlier, select it from a library, and then obviously then be able to read it. And in 2009, although we had multifunctional tablet devices and we had some of the initial e-readers on the market, there were none of those readers and none of the titles were deemed fully accessible for a blind reader to use. What we found across the last 4 years is that our recent research from 2012, and of course we can't carry it out until the end of the year has finished, so we've just released these stats, is that 84% of the top 1,000 titles of 2012 are now available as a fully accessible ebook. So I think for me, the journey that we've come on from 2009 to 2013 is a fairly sort of huge leap forward. That's very much looking at books in terms of eBooks. It's not looking at them in a hard copy format. So if people are not using the digital technology, that doesn't necessarily change the availability of titles to them. But in terms of eBooks, the leap that we saw very much between 2009 and 2010, that was very much to do with devices, and it was to do with publishers looking at the structure of files, and that's then improved with other publishers coming on board and other device manufacturers as we've gone forward. And actually to say that 99% of the adult fiction titles of last year were available to a blind user in large print, audio or Braille at the same time and the same price as the rest of the population is a massive step forward from where we were in 2009. And before anyone asks me, the two that didn't make it 100%, weren't actually available as an ebook, which meant I couldn't then count them as being an accessible ebook, but I couldn't actually say that. So 100% of those that were available as an ebook were actually available. So our work going forward as RNAB, just to finish off, we have a huge challenge as a charitable organisation at trying to keep pace with developments. I'm sure everybody in this room, it's been touched upon earlier today and yesterday, of the pace of change that everybody's dealing with. We're trying to keep up with that pace of change and development, and to make sure that those with a vision impairment and those other readers with a print disability, be that dyslexia or be that a cognitive or a motor problem, can actually access books and can access the digital revolution as it's taking place. We'll continue our partnership working. We do a lot of work with publishers, but also with the rest of the supply chain, which Hugh alluded to. So very much looking at not just is the book in an accessible format, but do the devices do what we need them to do? Is the software that's driving those devices? Doing a lot of work with software companies, but also looking at retailers and looking at the websites, because you may well know that a book's out there and it's accessible, but if you've got to visit a certain website to access the title to start with, and that doesn't work for you, the actual stages along the supply chain is vast. And then the other couple of things finally is we've also got a duty to raise awareness that as much of the digital sort of titles out there that are becoming more and more accessible, part of our remit is to make sure that blind and partially sighted potential users know that this technology is there, and actually that we support them in terms of converting to using it, and actually finding out where that they can find advice and assistance once they have switched to utilise the digital technology. And also just supporting other parts of the publishing world, whereas we focus very heavily on trade publishing, is actually starting to spread the message amongst other sectors to sort of say, things are out there, they are accessible, there's things you can do which the other speakers are going to allude to change that. But actually, the pace of change is, as you've seen, very, very quick. And then finally, open up greater access to published materials across all sectors. And the vision has to be that any reader with any print disability, blind, partial sight or other, can access any title that they want when they want to, the same as every sighted person in this room. Thank you very much for listening, and I think I'm handing over to Alistair.